Hey, you're listening to Hear This Idea, a podcast showcasing new thinking in philosophy, the social sciences, and effective altruism. In this episode, we talk to Armond Cohen, the Executive Director of the Clean Air Task Force. The Clean Air Task Force has been rated as one of, if not the, most cost-effective climate change charities in the world, including by organizations such as Founders Pledge, SoGive, and Giving Green. To give a sense of what that actually means in practice, Founders Pledge has estimates that for every $1,000 that the Clean Air Task Force spends, it can avert around 100 tons of CO2, which is roughly the same as about 200 people switching over to a plant-based diet. Founders Pledge also estimates that the Clean Air Task Force can avert a death that is directly related to air pollution for just under $6,000, which, if you're into charity evaluation at all, you'll appreciate that these numbers are just phenomenally good. So how do Armond and his team do this? Well, the Clean Air Task Force is more technology-oriented than most other NGOs working in this space. And they are especially good at spotting technologies that are currently being neglected by mainstream discussions, but which might have a huge impact on our ability to fight climate change. Plus, the Clean Air Task Force is also unusually good at getting this cutting edge of research transformed into actual US policy. So, in our episode, we talk to Armond about some of the past successes the Clean Air Task Force has had in its 25-year history, including their work on super pollutants, carbon capture storage, and shutting down coal plants. We also hear about the Clean Air Task Force's upcoming plans to expand their work into new areas and countries, as well as some general advice from Armond, who has been working on energy and environmental policy for 3 decades now. I felt like I learned an absolute ton talking to Armond, both in terms of what technical solution environmentalists should be supporting, and how we should be approaching the politics to try and achieve this. Without further ado, here's the episode.
So I'm Armond Cohen. I'm Executive Director of the Clean Air Task Force, which is a non-governmental environmental research and advocacy organization. And I spend most of my time managing a 55-person knowledge-based organization. And kind of keeping all the pots boiling, so to speak. Sometimes I impersonate a subject matter expert on some issues as well, as we'll get into today. But I started my career as a lawyer advocate and then founded this organization about 25 years ago to focus much more directly and singularly on the energy system.
Awesome. That's really interesting to hear. And it's going to be super exciting delving into all of this different work that you and your organization are doing. But maybe to ask a bit about your own kind of journey here, how was it that you came to be interested about climate change, or as you mentioned, energy systems more specifically?
Yeah. So, I mean, I really started my work in the environment actually back as a, high school student, concerned about really what were then the more visible forms of pollution, like water pollution, air pollution. And, the problems were different then. I'm ancient, so this was like the 1970s. And the Lake Erie in the United States was burning because of petroleum on the surface and chemicals on the surface. The air was filthy in most major U.S. cities. Raw sewage was being dumped into lakes and oceans. It was a very different set of issues, and the early wave of legislation that I kind of worked on as a high school student, got passed in the 70s, and the air got a lot cleaner, and certainly the water got a good deal cleaner. So that's how I got into these things. I got interested in energy actually sometime in my law school years. Just took a course on it, found it fascinating, and actually in some ways that's now almost 40 years ago. Many of the same themes. Climate change wasn't on the radar then, but the notion of quote unquote sustainable energy had already come into the picture. And so I first got interested more, frankly, it was more of an intellectual interest. And then in my first job, real job, after finishing my law training, was working for an environmental organization in New England in the Northeast US. And at the time, and you'll find this amusing in light of our subsequent conversation, my first job was to stop a nuclear power plant from being sited in New Hampshire, nearby Massachusetts, where I live. And that at the time, climate change was not on the radar. It was thought that, between biofuels and maybe and a lot of energy efficiency, and wind and solar, we could avoid all the air pollution issues. And I believed that at the time. Nuclear didn't seem necessary. And so by doing those cases, I learned a lot very quickly. That was my graduate degree in energy planning and energy economics. And I just haven't stopped it since. And I think if you think about the chronology, so climate really, although it's been studied, for a century or more, going back to Arrhenius and other folks who had kind of come up with the original insights, essentially it didn't become a real public issue, I would say, until the mid 1980s and even the late 1980s, we can argue. And at that point, I was doing a lot of work on conventional air pollution, energy efficiency, and that was my major focus the early part of my career, which you'll also find amusing in light of what I'm going to say later on this podcast about the potential for energy efficiency, which I think is there's something there, but it's not the cure-all. In any case, as climate came into the picture, my work began to focus much more on what could we actually do to avoid CO2 emissions. And since 75% of the CO2 on the planet is coming from the energy system, that sort of was a natural crossover. And that's kind of where I began my climate focus. I was led to found this organization 25 years ago because it was really clear by the mid 1990s that climate might be the overarching challenge certainly from an atmospheric standpoint. And so we decided to dedicate the organization just to focusing on the energy system and climate interactions. And I think we were probably the first non-governmental organization, environmental organization in the world that had that exclusive focus.
How did and how do you think about how the Clean Air Task Force fits into the broader environmental movement? And in particular, you've used this phrase crowding in, as in crowding in support. Can you say what that means?
Let me just say, frankly, sometimes I say we are wonks and plumbers. That is to say, I think we do campaigns. We don't directly do campaigns, but we work with campaigners and we start campaigns. So there's a public-facing communications component to what we do for sure. But there are many, many other organizations that do that and have the capability and have very large networks to be able to pull off that kind of work. Our focus is really on relatively technical issues and pragmatic solution pathways. So we do a lot of work trying to understand technology at a fairly deep level, interacting with the private sector, the technology developers, the scientists and technologists who are working on advanced technology. And we think fairly deeply about the markets, how they can enter those markets, and then what the policy supports are. So, a lot of other organizations rely on us for technical analysis that they don't necessarily have the capability to do. And by technical, I mean both, physical, chemical, biological, sciencey stuff, but also economics. And then finally, when it comes down to writing a bill or crafting a policy, there's a lot of mechanics around that, like what's actually going to work in terms of a government program and how do you not waste money on stuff. We have a fair amount of knowledge about that and how to make sure that legislation, regulations are written in a way that actually gets the job done. So our role in the environmental movement is, very much, twofold. One is that this technical piece and the sort of, I call it plumbing, actually making things, translating high-level policy objectives into actionable activities by the private and public sector. The other part, frankly, is that we have a somewhat different view of the climate situation than a lot of NGOs, as we'll get into later. We take a very technology agnostic approach. We support almost anything that's zero carbon, at least exploring it. There may be some dead ends, but we think that having multiple options to solve climate change is an absolutely critical strategy. That is not the view of a lot of environmental organizations, as we'll probably discuss later. So, and we've tried, we respect our colleagues and their viewpoints, but we disagree on some points. So in that sense, I would say, in addition to being technically oriented, I would say we offer a somewhat different perspective that is, trying to push some of our colleagues on some of these issues, but there's room for all voices, and in that sense, I think there's a good ecosystem out there. In terms of crowding in, I think our view is that we're trying to bring more voices to the table for climate action. So one of our strategies since our founding, we sue all the time. We use the courts. We're adversaries to fossil fuel corporations. I've had many fossil fuel executives scream at me in their boardrooms. At the same time, we talk to them, and we try and understand what their sort of technical capabilities are, and actually how we can work with them. And a good example of that is you're beginning to see a number of the large fossil fuel companies. I mean, Shell, BP, Total, ENEL would be examples. Equinor in Norway are beginning to sort of turn around on this issue, and to get sort of the major oil companies and gas companies starting to think about climate strategies. I call that crowding in. That is to say, bringing in more perspectives to the table, and also these people have a lot of money and influence. So if they're going to turn a bit, that adds momentum to the whole movement. And frankly, I've been surprised at how quickly that shift has occurred. It seems like in the last year, it's just gone into hyperspeed. So anyway, that's what I mean by crowding in. It's really turning in climate change from an identity movement and maybe a cultural signifier into a practical plan of action. And I think we've just crossed that threshold. In the last, honestly, it's in my 30-year career, I've never seen such a rapid change in the approach of politicians, the general public, and the industrial corporations.
We recently spoke to the Good Food Institute, and I'm hearing really close parallels where they are also in this mode of shifting the kind of animal advocacy movement from a kind of just a signifier of some allegiance to a practical project. And they are also speaking to executives in the major meat companies and making this case that moving in the direction of protein alternatives could be in their interests. And they've also said something very similar to what you said, which is that they're picking up on a kind of change in attitude from politicians and industry, and also just the public in the last maybe half decade or so. So it's kind of exciting to hear these parallels.
And just a comment, as an undergraduate, I studied intellectual history, and there's a very famous article about generations and the influence of generations on social change. I think it was Karl Mannheim who wrote about this maybe 70 years ago. But I think a lot of what's going on is generational. So I'm 63 years old. I was in junior high school during the first Earth Day, and I'm the same age as the people running all these industrial corporations. So there's a way in which they've grown up in an entirely different environment. Now they may have gone through MBA training or something like that, or become engineers or whatever, but there's still that around 1970, there was just kind of at least in the developed world, there was a kind of a paradigm shift around environment. And I think you can explain a lot of that. Early in my career, I was really dealing with people in control who, they came up, they were mostly the so-called greatest generation, people who had lived through World War II or had grown up right after World War II. And, environment was a bit of a luxury as the world was attempting to grow economically. And I think there's, this kind of post-industrial kind of acceptance that environment is an important thing is really shaped, I think. So I just biographically, when I look at the people I deal with, even the people I deal with in the fossil fuel corporations, they've had environmental, management training somewhere along the way, because that field didn't even exist 40 years ago. So it's fascinating, because what we're talking about is as much social change as technical change. In fact, I could argue it's much more about social change than technical change.
it's really amazing to see. I guess you've touched on two different points here. On the one hand, how much the environmental movement itself has changed and the things that they've cared about. And on the other hand, the landscape that it's kind of working in as well has changed a tremendous amount. And I'm sure most of our conversation will be spent about what the challenges are today and what we should really be focusing on. But before we do that, I'd really love to hone in on maybe some of the early days as well of the Clean Air Task Force. I believe you're celebrating 25 years now, which is a tremendous achievement of being involved in this space. But yeah, I would just like to really hear about what it was like at the very beginning and what you were kind of focusing on. I guess from the name as well, there was a lot of attention on maybe some non-CO2 polluting gases there.
Right. So it's a great question because, we do all this work on climate and people say, well, why are you called the Clean Air Task Force? Why aren't you called the Climate Task Force? And actually, that was a deliberate choice on our part. Back when we started in the mid-90s, climate didn't have necessarily the kind of traction that it does today as a public issue and broad public support. Our theory was that fossil fuel carbon-emitting sources both emitted CO2 and a bunch of other things that had more immediate health effects and environmental effects that people could observe. One of the devilish problems with climate change is that, climate is something that happens over decades and centuries, not over days and weeks and months. And although that pace of change is maybe accelerating a bit, but it's largely invisible. I mean, we have disasters, every now and then, and people say, oh yeah, that was probably made worse by climate change, and then they move on. The thing about smog or soot or acidification in forests or lakes is that people can experience that, and they experience it in their lungs and bad air days, and they can see the effects on forests and so forth. So we chose to focus on the most visible impacts of unabated fossil fuel use, and our singular focus at that time, when we started 25 years ago, was on the contribution of coal plants, specifically to those problems. And by doing that, we ended up really targeting a major source of CO2, and that was not an accident. Our theory of change was that if we could pinch down on the emissions of all these conventional pollutants, so-called conventional pollutants that damage health and the environment, and in the process, effectively force more costs on coal generation. That combined with, at the time, we thought, natural gas replacement would get us a long way towards our climate goals. Now, at the time, we didn't understand that what you really have to do is get to zero, and so substituting gas for coal is at best a transitional strategy, and some would argue not even that, for various reasons. But that was the theory of change: was make it more expensive to operate unabated fossil power plants, which were responsible for something like 70% of the total CO2 burden from energy system, and eventually they would retire, especially if cheap gas became available, which lo and behold it did. Not due to our doing, but due to fracking, one of the many ironies of the last couple decades. So that was the theory. We managed to get U.S. policy aligned around very, very stringent controls of emissions from coal-fired power plants. Natural gas helped by coming down in price, and now as a result, most of the U.S. coal power plant fleet will be retired by the by the 2030s, mid 2030s for sure. Probably most of it will be gone by the end of this decade, and a lot of that has to do with just the emission controls from nitrogen, sulfur, smog, soot, and air toxics. But increasingly, they also understand that CO2 is part of the picture. Now, ironically, we never hit our CO2 agenda. And the whole point of going after the conventional pollutants was to say, well, you've got all these immediate problems. And oh, by the way, CO2 is an emerging issue that you have to worry about. Why don't you just get out of coal now, or as soon as you can, and start on something else? Because you can, put a scrubber on and maybe get away for another decade, but maybe switching entirely to a different fuel or renewables would be a better option. And as a result, we had proposed that a so-called four pollutant strategy, which again, the ironies and the contingencies of politics are fascinating. In the late 1990s, we actually had the U.S. power companies agreeing to CO2 limits on their power plants, along with all these other limits. And there was a brief pause with the election of George W. Bush, and the utilities were actually still on board, but this is the great man theory of history. So Dick Cheney basically contradicted or instructed his president, George W. Bush, that there was no way that the Republicans should agree to carbon limits. And that was the end of that. So, frankly, that one event is fascinating. That one person really delayed progress for essentially 30 years. We have the utilities back at the table now. We have a favorable U.S. administration. So now we're sort of back to where we started in some ways, although we've certainly got a lot more of the industry on board and the public on board. But anyway, that was the whole theory. We started out focusing on visible local pollution sources. Sometimes I like to say that we won the air pollution fight the day that Senator Voinovich, who's passed away, of Ohio, which was kind of the epicenter of coal-fired power in the United States, saw that a study that we had commissioned appeared in the Columbus, Ohio Dispatch, and the headline was 3,000 Ohioans die every year from coal-fired power plant air pollution. And at that point, he told us, he said, at that moment, I knew things had to change, because it was no longer an abstract issue. It was something that was his constituents were going to care about. So this focus, the early focus, was much more on local campaigning around specific power plants and around specific visible environmental damages. Now, climate CO2 is a much more abstract issue, and it's harder to work on. So we've now shifted, strategies to maybe work more on the technology side.
I'll just flag as well to any listener listening to this who might want to have a look there, that the Clean Air Task Force has got a great infographic as well about all the coal power plants on their website, where you can also see exactly the kind of estimated deaths that are caused by it. And just looking at that infographic and really being able to see each location and being able to see your own community and the effects there is a really powerful thing. I can definitely understand why those sorts of messages help change senators and the way that they're thinking about these things.
I'll tell you an interesting anecdote, and this speaks to the power of information. When we started the task force in the mid-90s, there was some polling that suggested that most Americans thought that most of their electric power came from hydroelectric plants, when in fact something like 6 or 7% come from hydro. And so there was this sense of that just coal was invisible in an odd way. It was just an invisible issue. And so the first thing that we set out to do was to really make sure people understood where their power was coming from. And at that time, in the mid-1990s, well over half, as much as 60%, was coming from coal. So that's that by just giving people information and understanding the sources, I think we sort of pioneered some of those techniques. And now, of course, everyone in the world can go on a website anywhere of any of the major environmental organizations that work on this issue and see some kind of coal. We pioneered coal mapping, and we were happy to have that picked up as an approach, because at the end of the day, it is machines that are creating the pollution, and there are about 10,000 of them on the planet, and that's kind of what we have to deal with. It actually, in a way, it's a finite problem. I mean, it's a big problem, but it's finite and it's understandable. And that's kind of the approach we took, is like, let's name the sources, let's make it tangible, let's make the impacts tangible, and let's put forward solutions.
I have this impression that the Clean Air Task Force has been kind of consistently good at spotting, new or underrated or emerging issues in climate. We were talking about non-CO2 polluting gases. I also have in mind super pollutants. I want to ask about how that is. I mean, is there something about your way of thinking as an organization, or just your way of operating, that means you're able to be so early on these things so consistently?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to sound a little bit self-aggrandizing on our part, but yeah, okay, I'll brag today. I think, let's put it this way: my co-founder is a guy named Joe Chasen. And Joe came to this field from military intelligence. So, he's a pretty deep strategic thinker. And we assembled a staff that was highly technical, and really, we have a lot of physicists, biologists, chemists, mechanical engineers, economists, electrical engineers in our orbit, not all on staff. But I think it's the level of understanding of the mechanics of both the climate system and the atmosphere, coupled with a pretty deep understanding of energy systems, that leads us to kind of have the skill set to kind of think about these problems in a different way. And then there's just plain intellectual curiosity. And a lot of when I hire people, a lot of what I look for is just, are you interested in solving problems? And are you interested in challenging your own BS, and rethinking things, which we've done a number of times. Nuclear power would be a good example of that. So I think it's a little bit of organizational DNA. And again, I'm not saying we're the only folks who have that, but we tend to, one of our advocates says, we should take positions, but hold them lightly and be available and open to contrary evidence. And I just think there's a little bit of that. I wish there was more of that, not only in the environmental movement, but also obviously in the world at large. Things have become quite polarized and ideological. So I'd say that's, for example, on the methane issue, a good example is methane as a climate change pollutant was really off the radar. And scientists understood it at some level, but Jim Hansen, who's a famous climate scientist, published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2000, and he just basically extracted information from some existing studies and said, methane and black carbon may be warming right now at least half as much as carbon dioxide is. And moreover, it is something that if you control it, you get a very rapid cooling effect. So why aren't we working on that? I mean, it was a scientific paper, so it wasn't really advocating policy, but we immediately saw the implications of that. And it was our science director who saw that and said, wow, this is something we haven't thought about. No one's talking about this. And so we jumped right on that. And, we actually just went down and met with Jim at Columbia University and just pumped him for hours about everything he knew about this, and started pushing this idea. So, I mean, I think that, we're a bit of a think tank as well as an advocacy organization. And I think it's that think tank part that accounts for the innovation. Sometimes I say we're a knowledge-based organization with an advocacy arm rather than an advocacy organization with a think tank attached to it. You can argue it either way, but it's a much different approach, which is, you try and get grounded in the facts first and figure out what the story is, before you form your position. And then, as the facts change, you got to change your position.
So maybe one thing that would be really interesting to hear about from you now is where you see the current debate at and what kind of solutions you see. So maybe if I can provoke a little bit, if you're looking at kind of the debate now, what is maybe the most common misconception that you see when people think about what the solutions to climate change should be?
Yeah, well, there are actually a lot of misconceptions, but I think probably the top one is the idea that we can somehow conserve our way out of this problem by using less energy. I think that is probably the number one fallacy. It is not that conservation or energy efficiency, if you want to call it that, is not a portion of the solution, but and there's no question that a lot of efficiency improvement could be made, particularly in the developed world where we've improved efficiency, but not as rapidly as we might. But the overwhelming fact is that the U.S. and Europe represent together something like 35% of world energy consumption. Maybe that's a little bit higher, but in any case, the developing world is really, the poorer world is really is going to determine the climate future, and it's going to determine the future of energy. And right now, the average African consumes something like 5% per capita, the amount of energy that someone in the rich world and the OECD does. And of course, North America is higher than Europe, but on average, that's about right. These are energy starved parts of the world. There's still 600 million people without any access to reliable electricity, and another several billion that have access, but only sporadic and at very low levels. So their modernity is going to require, and humanity, just simple decency is going to require that those folks get a lot more access to modern energy levels. And when you look at those numbers, you say, yeah, we could cut energy use in half in the OECD, but it's going to be swamped by the next growth in the next century. Just to give you one little factoid, so Europe, and just look at the last decade, Europe reduced energy demand by something like 4 or 6%, depending on how you count. But the developing world increased their energy use by 600%. That's kind of what, and a lot of that was China coming on stream, but also Vietnam, Indonesia, much of Asia. It's a numbers game at the end of the day, and a lot of energy or effort can go into energy efficiency. And I'm not saying there shouldn't be some there, but I think there is a sense that somehow we're just using too much, and if we just all cut back, we could really make a dent in this problem. And I would argue that what you're doing is you may flatten the curve somewhat, but the curve is still going to be extremely steep. So the question is, how do you basically double the energy supply on the planet and make it zero carbon at the same time? And 80% of that energy right now is coming from untreated fossil fuels. So that's the biggest, I think that's the biggest fallacy. There are a bunch of others, but we can get into later. But that I think is the most dangerous one in some ways, because it understates the size of the problem and tends to make people think somewhat less radically about the solution.
I definitely want to follow up on that a little bit and maybe ask, where do you think this misconception comes from? Because one thing that definitely strikes me when I think of myself as just an individual or a consumer or just somebody living in a Western country is it's a lot easier for me to try and change my own consumer habits, maybe buying local or not using plastic bags and the like. But when I think of this, as you said, much bigger problem, there's very little that I as an individual can do, in getting whole countries to change their energy system and the like. So I guess my question is, one, where do you see this misconception coming from? And then maybe also as a second follow-up question is, if we do see this as our diagnosis, then how can individuals kind of buy into this message and support these solutions to these much larger problems, as you said?
Yeah, I mean, as far as where the misconception comes from, look, I think it's very well intentioned, and I think I'm not downgrading or attempting to criticize people who try and look at their own lifestyles or fly less or whatever. I think that's actually good on a number of levels. May not have a huge dent on the problem globally, but it does make you conscious of the issue, and I think that's a good thing. I think where it gets dangerous is when you mistake that for a large scale solution. So I think part of it just comes from the sort of general, this is very complicated, and a lot of environmental historians have written about it. I think it comes, from a certain change in Western attitudes generally about consumption, which you begin to see emerging in the 1970s and on. But that's kind of history. And in the second part of your question, look, I sometimes say the most important individual action you can take is to vote for people who are going to take action on this problem. I mean, far and away. I mean, these are big systems. As I said, there are 10,000 power plants on the planet. That's a finite number of things. There are policies and actions that can be taken to either replace them or clean them up and get to zero emissions. There's technology to do that. Some of it's more mature than others. You need to elect politicians who are going to make that kind of action happen, and demand it of corporations and so forth that they move in that direction. So by far, your biggest impact is as a citizen, as opposed to as an individual consumer. Again, not to denigrate your individual actions, but you do have to look at the whole. And there are leverage points in this technological system that if you can get the right direction of travel, is just going to provide so much more leverage than all of us trying to conserve. Sometimes I offer people the thought experiment, which is, let's say that energy had no, impact on air, water, or land. Would you care? Shouldn't we all just use as much energy as possible? And people kind of get stumped by that one, because it's sort of, there certainly are religious and other beliefs that would suggest that, just too much of anything is not a good thing, almost on principle. But it is an interesting thought experiment to run you through. I'm convinced we can get to an energy system, maybe not by 2050, but well before the end of the century, that essentially has, a negligible impact on the planet. And if that's the case, I say, why shouldn't people have access everywhere to the internet, to warmth, to mobility? We can argue about aesthetics and that sort of thing, about whether we really want to be running around in cars in 2070. But I think the whole trick here with climate, and this is a struggle, is to move out of a purely moralistic, almost puritanical framework of thinking about, we've got to just use less, and energy is somehow itself a problem, to actually energy is an enabler of a lot of really good things. It's responsible for a lot of modernity as we understand it. And there are some people who don't like modernity. So then you get into that argument. But assuming that, putting that argument aside, I would say that the key here for most people who are thinking about this pragmatically is, how do we move specific technologies and market structures and policies into place that would basically have a zero impact on the planet? And, I think we've seen in so many other areas really good trends, and energy is moving in that direction. It's just not fast enough.
Yeah. So you made this point that there is a group of people who get maybe unhelpfully hung up on this idea that energy efficiency and cutting back energy use just is the silver bullet. It is the central solution when it comes to climate change. And it made me think, I watched a talk of yours yesterday where you brought up this Isaiah Berlin essay, The Hedgehog and the Fox. The fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. Obviously, that wasn't about climate, but can you say something about what it means to be a fox in this sense when you're approaching questions about climate solutions?
Right. Well, the Berlin essay actually had nothing to do with energy, which is interesting. It really had to do comparing two Russian writers and their different attitudes to the world. But it really, what he was talking about was granularity versus generality. And I think his point in the essay was that there is a way of looking at the world in which you have a single organizing idea, and everything else, all your actions revolve around that. And then there is a different way of looking at it, which is that of the world, which is that there's very complex systems, multiple vectors, social, economic, political, technological, that align to create, where we are today, the mess that we're in today. And you have to kind of think about each of those pieces. So in the energy context, the single big organizing idea, or maybe the two or three big kind of, I'll call them the hedgehog ideas, would be use less, electrify everything, and wind and solar can solve. We have enough wind and solar on the planet to solve everything. And those are kind of the three big organizing ideas that, I, again, with all due respect to my colleagues in the movement, I think that's a fairly dominant kind of hedgehoggy view of the world. I think, as we'll get into, and I guess in a little bit more discussion later, a Fox approach would be to say, well, let's look at each of those pieces. We just talked a little bit about energy efficiency and the problem of absolute demand swamping efficiency. We can think about the issue around electrifying everything. Well, that may work in some circumstances, but there may be whole sectors of the economy where liquid or gaseous fuels may actually be necessary. Now, we might be wrong, but we've got to be open to the possibility that to actually create cement and steel, to power long distance freight or marine shipping, we're going to need some kind of power dense fuel, or to balance the grid. By breaking that problem down into sectors, it gets more complex all of a sudden. And then the last bit on renewables is, and by the way, I spent a lot of my career pushing wind and solar, still do, think it's a great part of the solution, but to sort of leap to the conclusion that that sort of wind and solar combination, maybe with some lithium ion batteries, will solve all of the electric grid problems, is another one of those hedgehog ideas. It's very sticky in the public discourse because it's very simple, it's very clear, it's very attractive, and it might be right, but it might not be. And I think that the Fox way of thinking is, you know, really hedging. And sorry for the pun there. I guess hedging and hedgehog go together more, but hedging your bets and taking a probabilistic view and multiplying your options rather than restricting them is more of a Fox way of thinking. And I think that's kind of what Berlin, actually not just in that essay, but in his whole career, kind of spent his life arguing against what I would call intellectual monoculture, in which there's just simply one overarching idea. And I think his point was that it's kind of out of fashion these days because you might call him an old-fashioned liberal, but in a way he was just saying, let's be open to the fact that there are just multiple perceptions of reality and what the good is, and that if we're going to survive on the planet, we really have to come to some accommodation and find ways in which everyone can see themselves in the solution set, rather than trying to exterminate the other side or beat them into submission. And I'm afraid that's just too much of the rhetoric out there right now on climate, not to mention everything else that we see in the world, is based on a kind of Manichean, black and white view of things. So that's kind of the approach we take. And I not to be critical of any of my colleagues, I have to say earlier in my career, I sort of to take this good and evil approach to things, but maybe it's just my advanced age that leads me to a somewhat more nuanced view.
This seems to maybe link to something you were mentioning before, which is this idea that too much of a single thing will just have, there's an instinctive reason why we think that there might be problems with that. And one way you could think about this is that if you just scale anything to like a certain scale, you will start having unintended consequences that you can't even foresee yet. And maybe one thing that people are discussing about in the regards of like solar or wind is that, they might not produce CO2, but there are other problems with these things where if you think about, okay, well, if you now need to produce as much solar and wind as there is currently fossil fuels on the scale, that is like way more than what people are currently imagining. And you can imagine all sort of like resource constraints with just the materials you need. You can imagine waste that happens when these like physical machines just start breaking down, and we need to do something with that. And also just what if we're wrong, right? Just putting all your eggs in one basket can be incredibly risky. So let's maybe unpack here a bit as well what the Fox attitude would then be. And if we're saying that we're not going to invest everything in solar and wind, what would be some of the alternative technologies that you're really excited about?
Categorically, you don't have that many options, actually. So they're basically three buckets. There's renewables in various form, and we've just defined renewable. I mean, that's a blurry definition, but let's just say wind, solar, geothermal, tidal energy, hydropower, and burning plants, which some would argue is not renewable. But anyway, as I said, there are a lot of definitional issues there. But let's just say something other than fossil fuels is one category. The second category, the second bucket, is nuclear, basically, splitting uranium. And then the third bucket is fossil fuels, but with the carbon taken out. And I guess you could say the fourth is energy efficiency, as we discussed before. But you really only have four levers to pull in the energy system. So it's at some level, it's not that complicated. You can talk about how to mix and match those. Our view would be that you want to be pursuing all four of those quite aggressively, because you don't know which one is going to run into roadblocks. And I can pick holes in each one of those. I advocate for the development of a nuclear power option, but I don't think it's a single solution or is necessarily better than any other solution. I advocate for the scrubbing of CO2 out of fossil fuels and making electricity from natural gas, as well as making hydrogen or ammonia from natural gas through scrubbing out the fossil fuels and using the hydrogen that remains. But those are not perfect solutions either. And, I argue for renewable energy as much as we can do plausibly. And we can pick through each of those. And I can give you the negatives on each of those. We talked a little about energy efficiency and sort of the limits of scale. Renewable, you mentioned waste, material waste. That I'm convinced that that's somewhat of a second order issue, honestly, and I can't claim to be an expert on that. I think the first order issue is probably more to do with atmospheric impacts and land impacts. So let's just go down the list. So wind and solar are wonderful, but the spatial requirements are factor of 100, maybe more like 500 times higher than a very power dense source like nuclear or using fossil fuels with carbon capture. And again, you'll see numbers in the literature that are all over the map, but I don't think anyone would doubt that there is at least an order of magnitude difference. This becomes real as you try to scale. And if you go onto our website, you'll see some of these images. But a good chunk of a recent study out of Princeton University looked at what would be required to do an all renewable energy system in the U.S. And it amounts to occupying the land area of 7 or 10 eastern states of the United States. Now, granted, you can move around wind farms and you can farm around wind turbines, but we're already seeing at relatively low levels in the United States of wind and solar, which is about something under 10% of U.S. electricity right now. We're seeing it's very hard to site additional solar and wind onshore. There are big fights about offshore wind. And I think land use may be, and all the transmission required to support those dispersed sources, that may be much more of a limiting factor than economics, although the economics are there as well. So again, these are wonderful technologies, but they have their limits and unintended consequences, which may ultimately limit their application. Nuclear is a wonderful technology. It's very power dense, occupies a very small amount of space, produces a lot of energy, but we do not have a business model right now that can deliver nuclear at scale as rapidly as we need. And there's a lot of innovation that's going to have to occur around that. A lot of that will be regulatory change, but the industry has to standardize. These things have to be made more like airplanes rather than like cathedrals that you build once in a generation and then you stop because it had a cost overrun and you couldn't learn. This has to be a commoditized product. And frankly, we have a lot of education to do with the public about the risks, which in my opinion are often misrepresented in the public discourse. There are risks to nuclear. It is a technology that has seems to inspire singular dread in segments of the population. I would argue that it is an industrial technology that has similar risks to other technologies that we live with, whether we're talking about air travel or chemical production. But that's not necessarily a winning argument, and it is a very real issue and constraint on nuclear expansion. And then finally, carbon capture and storage, removing carbon from fossil fuels. It's demonstrated that technology there's no question it can be done. It does have an economic disadvantage right now against unabated fossil fuels, but then again, so does renewables. So that's not necessarily a killer argument. You're going to have to build a very large infrastructure to deal with that, sequestering as much carbon as we need to. Let's say if we did something like a third of our power and fuels came from natural gas with carbon capture, you would be in the same order of magnitude of infrastructure that is managing fluids and gases similar to the oil industry globally right now. So rebuilding all that piping for the CO2, doing the storage, all of that, that's a very significant climb. Again, none of these are fatal arguments, but they do suggest that if we really want to get to zero emissions in the space of a few decades, certainly before the end of the century, we would be wise to be mindful of the downsides as well as the upsides of all of these technologies. And it's just really complicated. And there are going to be local opposition, and people who don't like everything. We didn't get into bioenergy. There's a roiling debate about how much land you could really dedicate to bio, energy cropping. There's a huge literature around that. And these debates will go on. And we can't predict where this is going to go. Social change happens quickly. Some people say, You know, people are just going to have to get over their opposition to windmills and solar farms, and just agriculture is going to have to figure out how to put, PV on top of every crop. And then there are those who would argue, well, we just have to suck it up, and yeah, if you're scared of nuclear, so what? Climate's a bigger threat. How are these debates going to play out? I don't know. A lot of this depends on how serious people consider the climate crisis to be. What's the world going to look like 20 years from now? In terms of public attitudes, I can't predict. My job is really just to not close off any options, and to the contrary, cultivate options so that society can decide down the road what it wants to do. There is a fifth, by the way, bucket, which we haven't discussed, and we don't do a lot of work on, which is carbon removal. That is sucking carbon out of the atmosphere through mechanical means, in addition to, afforestation and so forth. Again, there'll be a really lively debate about that, and I'm in favor of developing the option. We may need it. A lot of the climate models say we will have to go carbon negative in the second half of the century. So, again, people will debate the moral significance of that or acceptability of that down the road, I would like to at least have the option in case we need it. And that's kind of our guiding philosophy. In fact, if there's a totally unsexy bumper sticker for our organization, would be optionality now. Uh, we'll have to get a PR consultant working on that, but that is the essence of the thinking.
Outside of these kind of 4, maybe 5 buckets you mentioned, there are also some kind of very nascent, still kind of emerging technologies out there as well. So, for example, enhanced geothermal energy would be one, nuclear fusion would be another. Can you maybe give listeners maybe a quick recap of what these are, and maybe some of the reasons why we could be optimistic about adding these options into, and whether they're worth exploring?
Sure. No, and I think this goes to the question of optionality, because the more options we have, the better. 2 emerging technologies that we're paying particular attention to are what's called super hot rock geothermal, which is different. I'll explain, is a little bit different from our current geothermal, and then fusion energy. Um, Deep hot rock geothermal involves injecting water deep into the bedrock of the earth. And whereas a conventional geothermal energy source would be maybe a kilometer into the earth in an existing pool of water that's heated by rock, um, steam harvested up through a pipe and run through a power plant. That's quite limited on the planet. I mean, there is a lot of it, but it's ultimately pretty limited by geography, where you have access to these shallow pools. Super hot rock geothermal involves basically artificially creating a geothermal effect by drilling, say, 10 to 12 kilometers into the earth, where the rock is always hot, injecting water, looping it back up to the surface through another pipe, at which point it will be extremely hot, what's called supercritical water steam, that can run through a power plant or can be used to split water to make hydrogen. And that technology, if it can be proven, is available all over the planet. It has zero CO2 emissions. It could be relatively cheap, because you're really just drilling holes and injecting water. You're not having to burn anything, and you're not having to manage. There are things you have to manage in terms of the minerals that are brought up from the earth in the process of producing that water, but and that steam. But that's a very interesting emerging technology, and we're really pushing R&D in it. Could be a game changer. Again, might not be, but and there's some technical problems to solve with deep drilling and management of the undersurface flows. But that's one we're watching and trying to actively promote private and public sector activity on. Nuclear fusion is an idea that's been around for 70 or 80 years, really since the beginning of the understanding of atomic energy. It's different from what we have today, which is fission, which is splitting atoms. This is fusing atoms, or fusing different varieties of hydrogen, basically. This is how the sun produces its energy. It's a well-known reaction in nature. It's been a really elusive form of energy, because it takes a lot of energy to create the reaction. And the quest has been to create more energy than you then you put into the reaction. It's been a bit of a joke for the last 30 or 40 years. It's the standard joke is, fusion will be ready in 30 years and that'll always be the case. And we would argue that that has to do with the fact that it's been approached as a science project rather than as a commercial venture. And what we're beginning to see, and this has been very much spurred by the climate crisis, is a number of entrepreneurs in the space are beginning to say, how do we get from these massive science projects into building a machine practically that would have produced net energy and could be reproduced or manufactured at great scale? And there are now, actually, honestly, there's more money in the planet going right now into advanced commercial fusion than there is in advanced fission. And so it's a very active space. The advantages of fusion over fission are that the waste products are quite different in nature. They don't. It's not like they don't exist, but they have much shorter half-lives than nuclear fission products. The second is that there really is no possibility of a runaway reaction like there is with nuclear fission. So the notion of a system that gets out of control, as happened at Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island and Fukushima, is not a physical possibility with fusion. So although some advanced fission advocates, including ourselves, would point out that the advanced fission reactors also have self-limiting or self-controlling features. But fusion by its nature is you have to be injecting energy in to make the process run, so that if the process runs into problems, you simply stop injecting the energy and it's a self-exterminating reaction. So these are very interesting. And because of that, because of the safety and waste profiles, this is something you would need much less by way of safety regulation. Not none. You will irradiate certain materials, but it's a much lower level of concern. It's much more likely that, for example, these plants could be sited much closer to cities where the demand is, and not out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by acres and square miles of buffer. And those are just two examples of things that they're not exactly on the radar. Fusion, as I said, has been around, but more as more of a scientific discussion. But now, if we can move this into the commercial space of commercial plausibility, it could be very, very exciting. And there's a lot of activity in both of these areas. So again, this is something where the Clean Air Task Force moved on to these, understood, about 5 or 6 years ago. We started, again, because of our scientifically focused staff, started to take a look at that stuff more seriously, and started reading a lot and going out and meeting with the people who are actually working on this stuff. And we have an office in China that has connections into large Chinese companies that are interested in advanced technology, and we got them going on this. So it's an example, I guess, of how we tend to work, which is scouting technologies, seeing if there's real promise to scale, and then figuring out what we could actually do to advance them. Sometimes that isn't necessarily immediately a policy engagement. It might be just helping a company think through its commercial strategy or its technology strategy.
I'd love to speak a bit about policy and regulation and legislation. We had a listener question along these lines. This is from Kartik T21, who asks, what in your experience has been the research or technology that most attracts the attention of governments and politicians? Or more generally, what has been your most successful case study or research or tech-based political advocacy? So a chance there for self-aggrandizement again. And I would also add that you could maybe flip that first question and just say something about which technologies, to your lights, look kind of underrated or underexplored in policy or government.
In terms of the policy does matter. There's no question about it, because look, if we didn't care, if there was no policy here, we would just be burning fossil fuels forever without anything. I mean, the cheapest thing to do is burn coal and gas. So, absent a policy intervention, there would be no trajectory. We really wouldn't have wind and solar energy today at the prices we do, because there would have been no policy for the last 20 years that was designed to drive down their costs and make them more commercially plausible and technically able to be integrated into the system. So energy is a very policy inflected field. At least clean energy. Let's just say that. I mean, regular energy, we know how to drill for oil, and we can do that forever if we wanted to. But so policy is critical right now. Clearly, the attention is very much on wind and solar. People are very excited, as am I, about the drop in solar costs. It's been nothing short of miraculous. Although it's not really a miracle, it was just a lot of policy. We spent billions and billions and billions of dollars doing large scale purchases of solar and wind energy. The US started that, then Germany did it, then other European countries did it, and then a lot of the rest of the world did. And you create enormous amount of demand. People go into production, they learn how to build everything faster, cheaper, so you see a precipitous drop in prices. It's not rocket science. It's just industrial engineering and industrial economics. Scale and repeat performance means lowered costs. So that's the big success story of the last 2 decades is an enormous amount of R&D plus commercial or policy that pulled those technologies into the market, mandates that a minimum percentage of electricity be supplied by renewables. Enormous effect. Drew a huge amount of investment into the space and attracted some really bright minds. And that's the result. That's sort of happening with storage right now. People are very excited about storage, and so that's great proof of concept that if you actually say we want clean energy, and you're willing to spend what are really trivial sums in the total, picture. I mean, the global energy system is an enterprise that's probably in the range of $7 to $8 trillion a year worth of GDP. We're talking about a couple $1 billion, for a particular technology. It's not really material, but we have proven in the past that RD&D, or industrial policy, if you want to call it that, has had a big effect. Obviously, now nuclear fission is beginning to come onto the radar as a focus. We are seeing the U.S. government, for example, Congress has supported the development of advanced reactors. Carbon capture and storage, which is where we've probably had our greatest success to date, is becoming mainstreamed. Again, it's a technology that's been around for 50 years and actually used commercially in the oil industry. But that is an example of something that wasn't on anyone's radar. We were the first environmental organization in the world back in the mid 2000s to say this is really something worth exploring. Let's get some serious R&D going. Let's get some demonstration going. And interestingly, it's something that's attracted a lot of bipartisan support in the U.S. And I guess our biggest victory a few years ago was a tax credit or subsidy, if you will, for early demonstrations of carbon capture from industrial and power facilities, the so-called 45Q, which is the wonky term for it. It's part of the U.S. tax code. That was recently extended in December of 2020. And now there's just a bill introduced yesterday, also with bipartisan sponsorship, that would have increased the subsidy for that technology. Interestingly, the coalition that we helped put together on that ranges all the way from what I would call oil patch climate deniers to climate hawks, extremely green climate hawks. It's a fascinating example of, if you focus on technology sometimes and can put aside the ideology, you can make a lot of progress. And again, we were not the only actor in that, but I will say that I think we were the earliest champion of the idea that this might be a pretty important option to cultivate. And we set about creating a coalition of environmentalists and industry. Not everyone agrees. We have folks within the environmental movement who think that this technology is effectively just an enabler of continued fossil fuel use, and I understand that position. Again, going back to the thought experiment, if we can eliminate the carbon, and if we can eliminate the land and water impacts to negligible levels, I think that's a pretty good trade-off. But others would disagree and say we simply have to use. There's no fossil energy that could ever have any beneficial role in the climate transition. Anyway, an honest disagreement among colleagues, but we did find broad support and on that, and CATF's role in that was really to flag the the technical and economic opportunity, and to kind of help set the policy design in place. I will just note that it is the first time the U.S. Congress has ever enacted a effective price on carbon, which is an interesting precedent. You had Texas Republicans voting for basically pricing carbon at $45 a ton, which is quite a leap for those guys to acknowledge that actually the government should be paying to reduce carbon. So you make progress in steps where you can, and as you know, the climate issue is incredibly polarized in the United States, and this is one way to bridge that gap. And the CATF's kind of pragmatic centrist role creates a platform for those discussions to happen. That's kind of why we exist, I think.
Yeah, I really love this point, and it seems to almost echo back what we were talking about right at the beginning of our conversation about how to kind of frame these messages and how to build these coalitions. And in some ways, similar to how 25 years ago, there was this perhaps political, framing around this topic of clean air as opposed to climate change or CO2. And now we can see a framing here around technology and technological solutions as opposed to maybe partisan or politicized terms. And I think that's just a really interesting echo that theme seems to have spanned across the 25 years that you've been working in this field. And I'd love to unpack it some more, actually. So there does seem to be this question on the left now that Biden is in power and the Democrats have got kind of control again, about where bipartisanship should stand. And this is clearly a much bigger kind of existential question. But I would love to hear your kind of take on where this stands in the climate change debate, particularly, how important it is to get this cross-party support and to get, as you said, senators from Texas on board with these messages, or if it's worth kind of taking perhaps a more radical or kind of Green New Deal approach.
So, I think this might be a uniquely U.S. problem in many ways. You're seeing the fissures to some extent in the UK and Europe. I know you have your conservative factions that think that climate really isn't a problem. But in the U.S., it is a highly polarized issue, and there are many books and articles that examine or attempt to examine why that's the case. It's becoming an identity signifier as opposed to a problem to solve. And once you get caught up in identity, social identity, like I'm a climate denier or I'm a climate activist, it's kind of all downhill from there, because when it becomes a core identity issue, it's very hard to change your position. And I think that's the fundamental problem we have, whether it's an issue of technology of choice within climate advocacy or across the partisan divide. But look, I think we have no choice but to try and, if we're going to have stable policy, and you really do need stable, consistent policy over decades. That's what the solar and wind experience shows, is that the way we were able to pull solar and wind into the market and get scale and reduce costs was by having decades of legislation that stayed in place, and the ambition increased consistently over time. And even in so-called red states like Iowa, you had politicians who were willing to say, "Yeah, let's bring this stuff into the market, and we'll pay a little extra in the short term." The worst situation to be in, and we've been in this situation in the U.S. at the federal level for a couple of decades now, is to get a progressive administration in place, like the Obama administration, and you jam a bunch of regulations through because you can't get a majority in Congress, and then Donald Trump gets elected, and just fortunately, they were incredibly incompetent, and it took them a while to figure out how to unravel stuff. So we actually were able to get to the courts in time. We have a lot of lawyers on staff who know how to block things. And we blocked some of his rollbacks because they got such a late start. Their early moves were just, literally just professionally incompetent. And so we were able to beat some of their early stuff back. But they got a few things through that we now have to reverse. So ping pong is not a good analogy for climate policy making, and that's what we've been doing is playing ping pong, where one side gets the pen for a while, does a lot of stuff, and the other side comes in and undoes it. It would be comical if it weren't tragic. So what we're trying to do is find policies that could cross the aisle, and frankly, it's not just a Republican-Democrat issue. There are Democrats from coal-producing states, fossil producing states like Pennsylvania and West Virginia who are going to have to see some way forward within the climate policy construct that doesn't, kill the economy of their states, or the portion of the economy that's fossil fuel based. And, we can argue about whether that's really a legitimate issue given the small share of fossil in the economy of some states, but nonetheless, it's a political reality. So our approach, and I think this is President Biden's approach, is to attempt to find common ground where possible. And it may be that it's not possible to find common ground right now on carbon limits as a policy. It may be that all we can do is technology policy and move renewables faster, move the necessary transmission, move storage faster, move nuclear faster, move carbon capture faster, move hydrogen faster. Those would be big wins. I think that the energy bill of December 2020 shows that that was several $billions. I think $7 to $9 billion appropriated, or authorized, I should say, not appropriated, for advanced technology. The big push would be the big win would be a clean energy standard, which would require more and more of the electricity to be produced over a period of decades from non-emitting sources, to the point where it's 100% by 2050 in these policy designs. That's a bigger lift. We are actually having good conversations across the aisle. They're very quiet. I'm not going to name names, but there are people interested in that. And if the transition is structured correctly, I think there are people who would buy into that. It may be that we fail, and there's a need to just use the very slim majority in the U.S. Senate to jam something through. But that is definitely not the preferred option, because what happens if the House of Representatives flips, as it may well, in 2022, and the Senate becomes less favorable to the Democratic side. That legislation can be undone. There is some history of legislative rollback. So so I would just say that my general take on this is, if we can find a way to have what's the wonks call policy stability, I think is the term of art. That is some way to build a durable coalition. And I think it's really around the economics and doing sensible things that are geographically appropriate or relevant to the different constituencies. So that's where we're headed. I think that's what Biden wants to do, but it may be that the Republican minority is not willing to go along with that, and we're back to a Senate battle. At which point, I think the administration will play its card to use the slim majority to push things through. There's some technical issues with that around parliamentary rules, but there are ways in which that can be done. I just don't think that's a good outcome. There are two things I think that are going in our favor on this over time, and we may not get the full agenda done in the next 4 years. The first thing we have going in our favor is what we started talking about at the beginning of the podcast, which is shifts in social attitudes. And the polling will tell you that young Republicans think climate's a problem and something should be done about it. And so there's a cultural and generational thing going on, even on the conservative side of the ledger, and it's very generational. So over time, you can say we don't have much time, but Republican politicians are feeling some political heat, not to be in a denial position. And there's much less of that outright sort of wackadoodle denial that we saw years ago. Now they tend to talk more about the economy, or about, we don't want to kill fossil fuel jobs or whatever. Very few politicians are saying climate hoax anymore. And I think that reflects what their own pollsters are telling them, which is, hey, folks, people are experiencing real changes in the world, and, they're not stupid. That's the situation as I see it. And CATF really works hard to be nonpartisan. That's, I guess, another distinction we have with, we don't take positions on partisan politics. Our action arm does not support candidates of either party. We have good relationships with Republican staff as well as Democratic staff, and we sort of jealously guard that stance because, some say that, there used to be a saying that the only thing in the middle of the road is dead armadillos. We take a different view, that It's only in the middle where you actually get deals done and actually move forward. So that's where we are firmly placed, and we can only hope that the Republican minority is able to put aside their other objectives and see this as a win for themselves.
It seems maybe worth spelling out explicitly why stability is such an important factor, and I think you've already touched upon this, but I maybe will try to reiterate. One really important factor at the moment seems to be this trend of getting business on the side and investing in technologies. But these things, right, take a lot of time to pay off. Businesses need to plan years ahead, beyond the political cycle, and R&D often takes an even longer time to pay off. It can take decades, or in the case of nuclear power plants, even 30 to 50 years for these things to become profitable. And here the idea being that if you can't be sure how this long time frame will look like, and it keeps, as you said, ping-ponging across, then lots of investments that would be really good for tackling climate change and transitioning quick just won't come to be.
Absolutely. Look, businesses will tell you that they're risk takers, but they hate risk. Investors hate risk, right? I mean, the whole game is to absolutely put the risk on someone else and maximize profit. So policy certainty is absolutely what investors are looking for. And they need a price signal. They need some sense that these things are going to stick. Now, you could argue what you see oil companies doing right now, and gas companies, which is really thinking hard about how to kind of reposition their businesses for a low carbon future, is a product of some of the specific policies that are in play and that have actually been enacted. So we have several countries that have now ostensibly banned the sale of new fossil fuel cars by 2035. That market segment's gone. We can argue about how fast that's going to move around the planet, but UK, the EU, other places, some US states have begun to move in this direction. That's an absolute signal to, if that's stable, that is a signal to every car manufacturer, every battery manufacturer, every manufacturer of infrastructure or hydrogen fuel cell manufacturer, that there's a market out there. Now, if they think that's just a whim that's going to be overturned, and if there really is a risk that that's going to happen, capital is going to be much less inclined to move in that direction. So there's no such thing as absolute certainty, but the reality is that most legislation tends to be more stable than regulation because it requires coalitions, and it's very hard to undo legislation. Regulations can be more easily undone. So yeah, policy is the game. Again, I think we said earlier that in a sense, you could almost argue that policy trumps economics in the energy sector. And certainly that's true in the electricity sector, which has always been very, very highly regulated. Developing a social majority and, I'll just say social license, which I think is the other issue we haven't really spent much time talking about. It's one thing to pass a law. It's another thing to build something. And as I said, I think with nuclear, with carbon capture, and I think with renewables, we're running up against some of the social license issues, which is just literally, can you physically build stuff in real space? And that's a different set of challenges, but also requires some sort of stability. But in any case, policy is the game, and investors are going to stay on the sidelines and until they see policy. And that's why you see so little investment in advanced nuclear right now. And it's why you're only beginning to see the beginnings of investment in carbon capture, because we put together a durable majority in the US Congress that had very wide, I can't remember them, but it was an overwhelming majority past the tax incentives. And, that's not going to flip. If you're an investor in that technology, you're not going to reverse a supermajority. If it's a 51-49 vote, you might have a shot at maybe that'll get undone. But sorry, it's a long way of saying the broader the coalition, the more acceptable or socialized the policy is, the more investors are going to jump on it. And they're just. And I know many investors are trying to do the right thing, but at the end of the day, they're accountable to their shareholders, and they're not going to get out on a limb for something that's going to be pulled away in 5 years.
to maybe like take a step back and look at this big picture, I find this whole idea of like directed technological change super interesting, of not just saying that technology is something that just kind of falls out of the sky or something, but that it's something that we can actively shape. And solar energy just seems to be a super example of this, where we said, this is what we want to do. And then we get the policy incentives right. And we can actually shape what technology we're then able to use. One thing that I'm a little bit worried about is you mentioned before this kind of great man theory of history, and you mentioned how Dick Cheney was able to set back certain bits of regulation for almost a decade. And in some way, you can think that stability is really difficult to get, but in some ways, it might be really easy to undo, right? If the wrong person kind of comes along. And one thing in particular here, kind of looking across the pond from the UK to the US, has been kind of the effect of Trump. And I'm just curious what kind of your sense is in how damaging this might have been to, attempts at getting a consensus or getting at stability here, or if this is something that can be fixed or even improved upon, such that if something like this were to happen again, that these incentives stay in line.
Yeah, it's a kind of a signal noise question. Trump was noise. I think the signal is clear, but it is a matter of time. And Dick Cheney set us, I would say, not a decade back. He set us 3 decades back, because there was a deal to be had in 1999, and he basically spiked it. And I think the George W. Bush would have signed that deal. In fact, he campaigned on that deal, which was the electric power sector would start adopting some CO2 limits. So I don't discount that, but the fact of the matter is that here we are 2 decades later, and we've got a U.S. Congress with Republicans passing an effective price on carbon, at least for carbon capture, which is a start, and not denying, the climate's an issue, or at least, many, many, many Republicans not denying the climate's an issue. So, the great man problem is a problem. I think this is a really complicated topic, but the what Trump represents, clearly Trump didn't care one way or the other about climate, but what he was tapping into was a larger thing that we're seeing in Western societies, which is, and for that matter, in developing countries, which is this massive populist sentiment or political movement that's distrustful of elites, distrustful of science, distrustful of analysis, and, sees this kind of cabal of, elite decision makers changing the world in ways that people are uncomfortable with. And that's the bigger problem, right? And I think that the policy details didn't matter in this case. It wasn't like, do the Republicans really care about climate? I think what they see is that their constituency, and there's some really interesting articles about how maybe the Democrats actually were the first to weaponize climate and the Republicans just responded. And, that's an interesting argument. But once something becomes a cultural issue, and it becomes weaponized for partisan purposes, it is very hard to get over. So I would say it's not so much the great man problem; it's the great idea problem of having a kind of an ideological formation. And I will criticize some of my colleagues on the left for doing this as well, of just kind of demonizing anyone that doesn't sort of 100% take we can't use fossil fuels ever again for any period of time or for any purpose. Or nuclear is out of the question. I think that it's the persistence of hedgehog ideas, to go back to the earlier point. If you get 2 hedgehogs fighting each other, it's not very pretty. And that's the bigger problem I have is, have we reached such a point where we can't depolarize the climate issue? And then the Trumps will always be there. There'll always be opportunists who will come along and play an issue the way they want to play it. But I think it would be a mistake to confuse, what Trump did to us as sort of any kind of specific policy agenda. It was just about mobilizing a very angry base of people. Anyway, I suspect some similar dynamics, play out in the UK. But as far as the damage he did, it was considerable. We lost 4 years of progress on some really key regulations. We're going back at it through the regulatory process, but my greater faith is in the legislative process because, again, Congress just doesn't like to undo laws that it passed. And the history is that the ratchet on environment usually only goes one way. And usually what happens, and I'm old enough to have lived through these fights where the opposition will say it's going to cost too much and it'll destroy the economy. And then you pass a law, and guess what? Like the costs really come down, and it's noise in the economy. And so that's why if you can get something passed as a matter of legislation, you usually have much more stability than where someone can undo something with a stroke of a pen. But we did fight Trump. We won some battles. We lost some battles. I think we'll be fully regain our ground within the next 2 years on the regulatory front. But I think the Biden administration is also being very careful to do this in a way that doesn't just promote backlash and create we don't know who's going to be president in 2024. Yeah, we don't want to overreach. And I think that's a lot of the debate you're going to see right now is like, how hard can we push? I am by temperament somewhat of an incrementalist more than I used to be, and thinking that let's grab what we can and get a beachhead. And that is the history of environmental regulation, is that we don't do everything at once. We experiment, we put in place policies, we find they don't destroy the economy. People actually like clean air and clean water. They like clean energy. Then we'll take the next step.
I'm keen to ask about the future for the Clean Air Task Force. For instance, I know most of your work is focused on the US to date, but as I understand it, you're looking now to begin to operate in more countries. Can you say something about that, and also say something about any kind of headline goals or plans that you have in mind for CATF in the next few decades?
Most of the world's energy use and carbon emissions right now are in the developing world. It's roughly equally split between the OECD and non-OECD. That's going to change in the next couple decades, and the poorer world will overtake the U.S. in both energy use and emissions. On the energy side, that's a good thing. It means that those economies are growing and people are getting more access to modern levels of heat, light, and mobility. So that leads us to, that led us to say we got to get more serious about the global South. And so we have a pilot project in sub-Saharan Africa. We've hired a woman named Lilia Darno, who is born in Ghana, is an energy expert who's been thinking for a couple decades and working on energy and development in the poorer world. And we're sort of in the process of really talking to the institutions and thinkers in the region of sub-Saharan Africa about how they see the energy transition, what they see as possible energy futures. It's a region that has a lot of resources, both fossil fuel resources and solar resources and hydroelectric resources, and has a huge need for energy. As I mentioned earlier, the average African is consuming something like 5% of the average resident of the OECD, and rapidly urbanizing. And how do you dovetail that huge delta in energy demand? How do you dovetail that with the need to get zero carbon? And how do you develop the institutional approaches and so forth to make that happen? I think a big part of our work in the next few years will be to see if any of these ideas that we've developed and policies we've developed in the global North are at all applicable to the global South. What we'd really like to see happen, we're a very small organization, relatively speaking. I mean, about 55 people. The only way we're going to have influence on the world is by leveraging other people and other organizations. So we do a lot of partnerships in these regions. And so we hope to grow our partnerships, and we go out, we would like to raise money for other people so that they can do work. And so a lot of the work I do personally is speaking to donors about, well, we'd love to be funded and we need X, but, there are other people out there that need 3 or 5X, because Clean Air Task Force is based in Boston and Brussels. We're not going to be necessarily seen as the most important voice in Lagos, Nigeria, right? So the question is, who can you find in Nigeria to work with who's got local political understanding and the connections and the legitimacy to be working in those spaces? So that's kind of where I see us going from a geographical perspective.
Okay, and one more question on this. point, which comes from a listener, Ryan Tan, from EA Philippines. He asked about, are there people or organizations that you know of that are doing impactful work on climate change in Asia specifically, other than CATF?
I'll have to divide my answer into a couple parts. With respect to general campaigning on climate change, I think there are a number of organizations that have been quite effective at just raising general awareness. So, Greenpeace and their affiliates, very strong in Asia. There are Natural Resources Defense Council, Environmental Defense Fund. These are U.S.-based organizations primarily, or northern-based organizations in the case of Greenpeace, that have had a pretty, I think, a really good impact on the debate, at least the awareness debate. In terms of sort of more solutions-based approaches, and the kind of work we do, there aren't a whole lot of examples, to be honest with you. It's an underfunded area, and if there are effective altruist philanthropists listening to this, I would urge you to think more about investing in developing that kind of capacity to do the kind of work that we do. Not necessarily us, but just partner organizations. I just wanted to single out one organization I'm extremely impressed with in India, which is the Council on Energy, Environment, and Water, CEEW, which is very, very grounded in the realities of energy systems, very, very fact-based. Another organization in India I'm quite impressed with is the Energy and Resources Institute, and a third is I always get the acronym wrong, the Center for the Study of Science, Technology, and Policy, which is in Bengaluru. So India is actually quite rich in think tanks that can go fairly deep on technical issues and engage with industry and government. China, unfortunately, we have a presence there. We don't have a formal office because of the restrictions around foreign NGOs operating, but we do interact there. And unfortunately, there really isn't kind of a civil society organization there that I would say is really engaging deeply, and that's indigenous to China, and that's unfortunate because there really is a need for that kind of engagement. So that's I realize it's kind of a short list. Unfortunately, most of the donor support has been going to awareness raising rather than kind of solutions development in the global South, and that may be appropriate for this stage, but I think we are beginning to get to the point where more civil society engagement around solutions would be a desirable thing.
Okay, fantastic. So we'll move on now just to the very last questions. And the first one, which we ask everyone, is what significant thing have you changed your mind about, and why?
I think the most significant thing is I thought that it was going to take the electric power and oil and gas industry another 2 decades to get its head wrapped around this problem. And I was preparing for a knockdown, drag out fight over regulation and carbon targets. As I said earlier, what's changed my mind is just the reality that it's like a switch has been flipped. We see very large, I don't know what the current percentage of global fossil fuel companies that have made net zero emission commitments. It's fallen like dominoes. And then governments, I think we did an analysis recently that something like 30 or 40% of the world's CO2 emissions are produced in countries that have made varying degrees of commitment to net zero by mid-century. So what I think has changed, and what has changed my mind about our strategy, is we felt like we were going to be in a regulatory battle over whether and how fast. And now we seem to be in a challenge, I would say, about how. And that's a huge shift. And so I think that's certainly changed a lot of my views on this. I really thought that that these industries were going to be intransigent and would simply opt for managed decline rather than proactive strategy. And it's opened up a huge amount of opportunity space.
Great answer. And then the other question we ask all our guests is, what are 3 books, articles, films, or other bits of media that you'd recommend to anyone interested in finding out more about what we talked about here?
There are tons, but let me see if I can narrow it down to 3. And then I have a kind of shadow fourth that hovers over all of them. But so if I were going to recommend one book, people, on this topic, it would be Bill Gates's recent book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. And if you don't want to read that book, there's a TED Talk he gave 10 years ago, which is called Innovating to Zero. And it's a really painless 12 or 15-minute talk, or however long TED is, that basically summarizes the thesis of the book. He may have done a more recent TED on the book, but I think he got about 90% of it right. And I know there are people who think, Gates, well, people have different opinion about Bill Gates, but I think he nailed this one right. And I'd say it's the best single introduction to the complexity of the topic. So that would be number 1. I would say number 2, particularly on nuclear energy, which is a very controversial topic. There's a very good book called A Bright Future, written by a nuclear engineer and a U.S. policy expert, that I think sets out the issues quite clearly about nuclear's potential for climate mitigation. So I think that's worth checking out. The third is not a book, but it's an author that I follow a lot, and this is a little obscure. But there's a guy named Michael Sembalist, and oddly enough, he is not an energy expert as such. He is the chief investment officer for J.P. Morgan in New York City. But he's taken up the energy issue and the climate issue as kind of an avocation. And he publishes an annual energy newsletter, which is about 10 pages, 15 pages, something like that. It's crammed with really interesting insights. I read it religiously. I circulate it the minute it comes out, and it's really worth reading. He usually just talks about the big trends, and it's completely stone cold economic kind of investor, as you might expect, someone who's making investments. It's just like, what's real, what's not, how do you avoid losing your shirt? And I find that super useful. He's super honest about stuff. I'm sure he contradicts some of the official views of the bank on various issues, but they give him a lot of rope, and I would really recommend that. The last thing I would say is hovering all over at least the Gates and the Sembalist perspective on the world is an author, guy named Václav Smil, who is an incredibly prolific author. He teaches at the University of Manitoba, and he's been publishing for 20 years on energy and energy transitions. The reason I didn't recommend him as a primary source is it's pretty heavy slogging. He's very dense. There's a lot of calculations in his books. I mean, they're not impenetrable, but they are. I would say that Gates has said that Smil is his favorite author, and that's reflected. So Gates has taken.
I think there are short videos on YouTube
Yes.
of conversations between the two.
Yeah, so I would check those out, and then I would say, if there was one book of Smil's, I would recommend it would be Energy Transitions. I think that's the title of the book. But his thinking permeates both Sembalist and Gates's work, and I'm sorry. There's another one. Let me actually, if you didn't want to read about nuclear, let me put another one on the. There's a book called Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air by a former Cambridge. He died a couple years ago, unfortunately. A guy named David Mackay. This is actually available on the web, and it's you can also buy it in book form. So David Mackay, Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air, Bill Gates, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, and Michael Sembalist's annual energy letter. And then for extra credit, Smil or Stefan Fist's Bright Future. How about that? And as I said, if there's one single book, it would be Gates. It's well written. It's very concise.
Those are great recommendations, and we'll include links to all of those in our write-up, of course. But now the very last question is, where can people find you online and the work that the Clean Air Task Force does?
Sure. So www.catf.us is the mothership. And I believe if you click on there, you can get through to our companion site, which is our European office, has a kind of separate sub-site. Yeah, just drill in. There's lots of reports, documents, information there, and links to other sources. So, and we really do welcome engagement. And we like to talk to people who are interested in this field. We actually post. We have job openings, so we are trying to find good people who think hard and critically. And so some of our job announcements are, I believe, posted there now. So we'll encourage you to visit and find out. We try and put a lot of information up there that for people who are curious about this topic. I think the more educated you are on this topic, the better. As I said, facts really matter and are going to make a big difference in whether we solve this problem or not.
Awesome. And on that note, Armond Cohen, thank you so much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation, guys.
That was Armond Cohen on climate change and the Clean Air Task Force. As always, if you want to learn more, you can read the write-up at hearthisidea.com/episodes/Armond. There, you'll find links to all the papers and books referenced throughout our interview, plus a whole lot more. If you enjoyed this episode, you might also like our previous interviews, such as episode 30 with Isabel Bumacher on nuclear energy, or episode 21 with Bruce Friedrich on protein alternatives. And stay tuned for more interviews on climate change coming very soon. We'd be really grateful if you could leave an honest review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to this. If you have constructive feedback, there's also a link on the website to an anonymous form, or you can get in touch with us directly by emailing feedback@hearthisidea.com. We'd love to hear from you. And lastly, if you want to support the show more directly and help us pay for hosting these episodes online, you can leave a tip by following the link in the description. Thanks very much for listening.